Our homes are of great significance to us, and for good reason. During the past year of COVID, the importance of our homes has been reinforced to us again. With all the chaos of life, especially in the early days of the pandemic, we felt so thankful and appreciative that at least we could retreat into our comfortable homes, large or small, that served as a shelter, a safe space, a place to eat, to sleep, to laugh, to cry, to work, to learn, to daven, to exercise, and to live. The winter storm making its way through the United States this week has brought us some minor inconveniences here in Maryland, a little snow, a little ice, but it's brought about much worse devastation in places like Texas. The images coming out of Dallas and the surrounding areas showing power outages and evacuations and shelters filled and homes destroyed by pipes bursting and excessive freezing are startling. There's something particularly disturbing about seeing people being separated from their homes. Because for almost all humans, a home is the place where a person feels safe and protected, and a place that so molds and maintains our identities. Our homes help us to develop into the people that we are, and without them, we feel vulnerable. It makes sense for humans to live in homes and feel connected to them. It makes less sense for Hashem to do the same. Nevertheless, for some reason, he asked us to build him a home to dwell in. In our parsha, we read about the commandment to construct a mishkan in the desert. And the way Hashem phrases the commandment is, Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti besocham. Make me a sanctuary so that I can dwell in it. Hashem uses the word v'shachanti, to dwell, as if to tell us that he will come to live and occupy the home that we built for him, much like a human being would. In fact, the home that he had us build for him looked remarkably similar to our homes. Hashem's home, the Mishkan, like ours, had a sink, had a kior. It had a table, the shulchan. It had lighting, the menorah. It had a stove or barbecue, the mizbeach. It has dishes, spoons, scoops, forks. It had walls and curtains and tapestries and even artwork. It looked very much like our homes. It had all those components of a home. The notion that the Mishkan and later the Mikdash would serve as a home for Hashem is not limited to our parsha. David HaMelech so yearned to build a house for Hashem and completely equates his dwelling in a palace to the way that he envisioned Hashem dwelling in a temple. He says, "Vayiki Hashem HaMelech b'veiso v'Hashem hiniach lo misaviv mikol oivav." When David HaMelech got to reside in his home, as God gave him respite from all of his enemies, Vayor HaMelech l'Natan HaNavi, he says to Natan HaNavi, "Re'ena anochi yoshev b'beis harazim, v'aron Elokim yoshev b'soch ha'yiriyah." How could it be? I'm sitting in this beautiful palace, in this fancy palace made of wood, and God's box is in a tent. It's in a nothing. I live in a palace, so should Hashem. When Shlomo Melech finally fulfills the mandate of building the Mikdash, he reiterates that. He says, Bano vanisi beis zvulach, machon l'shivtecha olamim. I have built for you a stately home that you're going to dwell in forever. He describes Hashem dwelling in that home, living in that home, building a home for Hashem. The language of our parsha, the language of David and Shlomo, describing Hashem dwelling in a house, seems absolutely absurd. How can we purport to limit a limitless God or confine him to a specific space? How can we speak about a non-physical being dwelling in a physical home? How can an infinite being dwell in any finite space, let alone that which we mortal, physical, limited human beings construct? We know that Hashem is everywhere, not in any one space. As Yeshayahu says, Hashem is Melo Kol Haaretz Kvodo, the whole earth is filled with his glory. As the Zohar says, Leit Atar Panui Minei, there is no space on earth devoid of his presence. Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, as the song goes. Even Shlomo, who builds Hashem his home, who describes God living in that home, in nearly the very same breath, acknowledges how absurd the whole idea is to begin with. In his beautiful tefillah at the inauguration of the Beis HaMikdash, he says, Ki ha'umnam yeshev Elokim al haaretz? Hinei hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim lo yichalkelucha. Can I really make a place for God here on this earth at all, let alone in a building? God's place is in Shamayim, Shmei Shamayim, an inconceivable, limitless space, not here in a house. Hashem himself seems to reflect on the absurdity of this idea when he says in Yeshayahu, Kol Amar Hashem, Hashemayim kisi, v'ha'aretz hadom raglai, eze bayis asher tivnu li, v'eze makom anu chasi. The heavens are my throne, the earth is my footstool, I dwell everywhere. What does it mean to build a house for me, a home for me, a place for my abode? How could that be? If the idea of Hashem dwelling in a physical space is so absurd, actually impossible, why does Hashem ask us to build him this home? It must be that Hashem's command to build him a home, with all of the very human components and imagery, is meant not literally to enable Hashem to dwell therein, because Hashem is everywhere, but meant to help us as human beings relate to Hashem and to a concept of sacred space. Hashem understood that defining a specific space as his home, much in the same way as we define our spaces as our homes, and that defining a specific space as being holy, and that designating a specific place as being more sacred than any other is crucially important for our spiritual growth. Rav Kook, in a fascinating passage explaining a Gemara in Brachos about the Mikdash, explains that there are two goals in the construction of a Mishkan or Mikdash, and the designation of a specific place of holiness in our midst where we imagine Hashem to be living. Firstly, Hashem believed that we as human beings would be moved by the sight of the pinnacle of holiness, by the intense focus on spirituality, by the scrupulous attention to purity, by the adherence to every minutiae of halacha that would be observed in that space. Hashem believed that we would be inspired by the sight of religious personalities like the Kohanim who occupied that space. Hashem believed that if we could enter a space that we called his home, we would be moved to think about Hashem in a whole new way, and that the experience might stimulate our imagination to spiritual greatness and instill within us powerful yearnings for goodness and holiness and further connection to Hashem even after we leave the space. In the human realm, I've seen time and time again how after a person unfortunately loses a parent, Rahman al-Itzlan, the return to their parents' home can have such an impact on them. Even though the child can no longer see, hear, or touch their parent, when he or she enters the parent's home, they are flooded with emotion. Long after the parent is physically out of that home, the home itself, the thought that the home is related to the parent, the association of the walls, the pictures, the furniture, the colors, the smells, the sights of that space with the deceased parent evokes a very powerful, visceral response. The child often feels renewed connection to the parent in that specific designated place more than in any other. So too with the Mishkan. Even if it's only in our human mind that Hashem dwells there, the sheer association of that space with him can help us to get into the proper mindset and feel a connection. Secondly, the Mishkan was meant to have a collective benefit for us as social beings as well. The house of Hashem was meant to be a center in which we would not only be moved by the intensity of the Spirit, but also be moved by the presence of other like-minded human beings. Hashem hoped it would be a place of human unity, where we could rally together around a singular cause, Hashem and his Torah, bringing about greater sense of the collective and shaping our social bond and our national identity. While we may not have a mikdash today, we do have spaces that we designate as sacred spaces, as holy spaces, as houses of Hashem, our shuls. The Gemara calls a shul a mikdash me'at, a minor mikdash. Just like the Mishkan or the mikdash of old, our shuls today in some smaller fashion are meant to serve those two goals outlined by Rav Kook. Even though we know Hashem is everywhere, we designate a special space at the center of our communities and the center of our lives, which we call the house of Hashem, where we imagine Hashem is living to help us connect to Hashem and to each other. While home, school, and Beit Midrash are core and absolutely necessary components of religious life, and perhaps even more important in some ways than a shul does serve a very important role as the focal point for our spiritual growth. It's the physical space where, even if only in our mind, Hashem dwells. And when we come to that space to visit him, we can connect to him and to each other in a way that is more profound and more impactful than perhaps anywhere else. In December of 1972, the Rav gave a beautiful, although somewhat depressing, talk at KJ in Manhattan in honor of Rabbi Joseph Lookstein, Zichron Livracha, about the centrality of the synagogue, called the synagogue as an institution and as an idea. In the talk, he described how so many Jews in that time had stopped coming to shul. He says the activities and interests of this community do not revolve about the synagogue. The members of this community stay away from the synagogue. These lines about the emptiness of shuls and people staying away struck a deep chord in me this year. While Baruch Hashem, we have beautifully overcome the problem of that time, of the 1970s, and while Baruch Hashem, given the choice, I do believe people today would not stay away from shul. But the physical description of the events that the Rav described are jarring to me because, albeit for different reasons, we too have seen the emptying of our shuls this year. Because of the awful pandemic that we've endured, people have been forced to stay away from shul, and that is so hard to watch. I know many people have been very involved in shul life this year, whether through the many chesed activities that we have, or Zoom shiurim, Zoom events that KMS has held, and that is super. We have so much to be proud of in that regard, and it's brought us together in all new ways. In many respects, the shul as a community, as an institution, as an entity, has been central to people in a deeper way than ever before. However, the physical space of our shul, our actual mikdash ma'at, our designated space of holiness where we imagine Hashem to be living, sadly, has not been as central to us this year at all. We must recognize how much we are lacking by not being together in that space, in this space. Yes, thankfully, many of the functions of that space have been taking place outside of it. We can daven and learn Torah in many different outdoor settings around the community. We can talk to people in the streets. We can gather for socially distant events in yards and parking lots and parks. And all that is wonderful and strengthening and necessary and should not be minimized in any way. It should be applauded. However, we should also not become too accustomed to it, to the point that we forget the importance of our shul building itself. This parsha, with its command to build a mishkan, along with Rav Kook's perspective on why that was so important for our spiritual growth, should remind us that even if all the functions of a shul can be filled outside of it, there is tremendous value to the space and the building itself. While Hashem is found in every place, and while so many religious rituals and activities can take place anywhere, the designation of a space of holiness is something that cannot be replicated. The idea that one space serves the singular function of being a Beit Hashem, a house where Hashem lives. The idea that in the midst of our community, there is a place where we go that is different than any other place. And allows that space, which we designate, to have an impact and effect upon us that is immeasurable. It is that singular designation that allows the space to rise to the full potential of mikdash, of mishkan, which according to Rav Kook, gives us the ability to connect to Hashem and to each other in unique ways. On this Shabbos of Zachor, when we recognize how much memory plays a role in shaping our identity, I ask you to remember what it was like when we used to all gather together in our shul. On this week of Purim, I ask you to think back and to recall what it was like last Purim, when we were all together in our shul. Try to take yourself back to that time. Try to imagine the sights and the sounds and try to pinpoint what it felt like at that time. Try to recall, if you can, how your presence in the building helped to foster your connection to Hashem, to Torah, to Tefillah, and to community. While we may not be able to return en masse for a little while, in the meantime, we can begin to reflect upon what we had and what we lack and what we aspire to gain in the future. We can use this time to increase our longing and yearning and to remember the centrality of a Mishkan and Mikdash in Jewish life, with the hope that we may safely return to it with great excitement and energy very soon in our future. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.